to the Power in Excellence podcast.
You're listening to the interview, part of the Power in Excellence podcast series with Dr. John.
Hello and welcome to the interview. Let me start with a question. What happens when power isn't just something that you earn, but something that you inherit, where legacy, expectation, and scrutiny all arrive at the same time? Because stepping into leadership is one thing, but stepping into a leadership role shaped by your family, built by your parents, carrying history, reputation, and unspoken expectation, well, that's a different kind of pressure. Now add another layer. You're leading from a small Caribbean nation, but operating in a global industry where perception matters, where assumptions are made before you even enter the room. Now add yet another layer. You're a young female CEO, and that means that whether you like it or not, you're not just leading a business, you're also navigating other people's biases constantly. So what does leadership look like in that environment? How do you establish credibility? How do you lead with authority? How do you carry the weight of legacy? That's exactly what we explore in today's conversation with Shivana Laughlin, CEO of International Shipping Limited in the Twin Island nation of Trinidad and Tobago. This is a conversation about power. But before we get into all of that, I asked Shivana to take us right back to the very beginning, where it all began.
International Shipping Limited was started by my parents 29 years ago in 1997. I think their motivation for opening the company was that they had both worked for private companies, multinationals themselves, and experienced a lot of pressure. And they felt as though they did not want their children to have that experience in their work life. So they decided, let's open a company. Of course, I know they would have wanted to make their lives better financially, and that would have been, the main motivation. But I think they also really wanted the kids to have lifetime employment. So the business started then. There was, at that time, a gap in the market for freight forwarders because there were many carriers, shipping lines, that weren't providing the best service. So freight forwarding was a good place to enter. And they did, and they were quite successful with that. And then they got very heavily involved in the project side of the business, which was to serve a lot of oil and gas sector companies and larger companies that were working on bigger projects. And that did very well for them. And they became, I guess, specialists in that part or that little niche. And that did very well. They eventually opened a customs brokerage arm of the company as well, so that they could offer the full service. They opened the company in the US in 2015 in an effort to control the whole supply chain. My father actually passed, and it was myself, my mom, and my brother who remained in the business. Eventually, we saw an opportunity in Guyana because Guyana had discovered oil and gas, and we opened there in 2020. And then similar, we saw that Suriname was going to be probably the next Guyana, so we opened there in 2022. So those are the 4 markets that the business operates in now.
So you said just now that your parents kind of saw this as lifetime employment for their kids. What additional pressure does that put on you as a CEO? Because the CEO role is a high-pressured role anyway to start with. Does that add another layer?
Yes, definitely. Because it's not just about the company doing well, it's also to deal with all the family dynamics that goes with that. And there is pressure to continue that legacy regardless of, I'm going to say how you feel, but not just how you feel, like regardless of how it performs or, what happens between the family members. Is just always kind of hanging over your head that, you need to make this thing work regardless of what happens. And that's in addition to, the regular CEO pressures that exist.
When did you become CEO?
in 2023, so 3 years ago.
And had you been with the business before then?
Yes, I had been with the business for, I think it was about 18 years. I had taken a break from the business for about 2 years in between because we actually had an outside CEO for a while.
So if I spoke to Shivana from 10 years ago, what would she misunderstand about leadership today?
I think she may have underestimated how difficult it is to be in a senior leadership position. I think she may have undervalued how important having the right people in the right places is. Having not had the experience in a senior position or in that senior position, she may have thought that, HR was less valuable than I have since discovered that it actually is in a CEO role.
So just talking about that power, where does power sit in your organization? Is it in the title? Is it in the expertise? Or is it in client relationships or internal relationships?
I think power lies mostly in the internal relationships because influence is more important than title. I think people listen to the people that they respect, the people that they see, the doers, the carriers. Yes, they have the client relationships, but they also have the ability to influence others to do what needs to be done. So I think that power really lies mostly in the leader's ability to influence others.
In a family business where your mom, your brother are still involved in the business and the business that was started by your dad, that power dynamic is very different because by definition, you're employing people who are not family members. How do you ensure that power, the power of the family dynamics, doesn't silence the people around you from bringing forward ideas and pushing back?
Well, I would like to think that my leadership style is very democratic. So I don't really make decisions unilaterally. I'm very consultative in my approach. So I would meet with my senior leadership team and bounce around ideas. And we would kind of go with what's the consensus in the room. So I would never make a decision completely on my own unless, time doesn't permit you to consult. But for the most part, big decisions are made collectively. So I think because of that, putting the family aside, the employees feel that they can come forward with their input because their input is taken seriously and it actually has an influence on what is the final decision being made.
Have you ever created an environment that you think is maybe too agreeable?
Yes, I think that's one of the mistakes that I have made in my early days in a senior leadership position, where, you become so consultative or so democratic that everyone wants to pitch in, and then you end up with like a whole soup of a whole bunch of different ideas that it becomes like overly complicated to make a decision. So I think now I've kind of developed a bit more balance where you do take the points that make sense, that the offerer can actually back up with data, and you can respect those opinions and take that on, where, sometimes when people come up with something and it just doesn't make sense, you can kind of shoot it down early. So you take what's meaningful to that decision and kind of leave behind the extra stuff that doesn't make any sense.
Continuing that theme and questioning of decision-making, I want to talk about decision-making under pressure because shipping is notoriously unforgiving. We always hear about delays, we hear about costs, global interdependencies. How do you make decisions in that environment where sometimes there's no good option?
Well, the truth is sometimes you just have to do the best you can with the information that you do have at the time. A lot of it also is gut, because when you're in a high pressure situation where if you make the decision too late, there are resultant costs like rent and demurrage that mount on the daily. You have no choice but to make a decision quickly, and you don't have the time necessarily to go out to a bunch of people to get their opinions or even to gather the right data to make the best decision. So sometimes you got to go with gut and the consideration of what information do I have at this particular time, and just go with the best that you can, because there really is no other choice, unfortunately.
At Power and Excellence, we talk often about how communication and the response that you get to communication reflects or is a reflection of the meaning that the other person has taken. Have you ever had to make a call that you knew would be wholly unpopular but very necessary? And how did you communicate that to make it land?
Yes, I think being part of senior leadership, you do have to sometimes make unpopular decisions. I think that's just like a given. Yes, I've made unpopular decisions, and I would take the approach of communicating that in a way where I justify my decision. So I would explain why this decision has to be made, and I would set out my points as to why I believe this decision has to be made, and this is why. I think it works sometimes, but it also doesn't, because sometimes I think when a leader tries to justify or explain or over-explain too much, it doesn't always land well. Like, the recipients of the message are like, oh, well, she needs to explain it to us. She needs to justify it to us. When really and truly, I guess you don't. But that would be my approach still, because I still feel that people's buy-in in decision-making is very important, because instead of you making a decision on your own and then, people wanting to, when it blows up in your face, say, I told you so. I think if they all feel like, okay, we were part of it or we agreed with it, then they're more likely to support your decision being successful.
Yeah, there's a huge amount of research that backs that up, that people buy into decisions in which they've been a part of, even if their own particular approach wasn't the one that was finally taken, their decision wasn't the one that was taken, people will still buy into that. So how do you build that trust in the organization to let them know that, hey, you know what, we're going to make a decision, we're going to take your ideas, but we're not necessarily going to run with your idea? How do you build that trust?
Well, I think that's built over time. So over time of consulting and then taking their ideas sometimes, and even, foregoing what I think the best decision is in favor of what the group agrees the consensus is. That builds trust, because they realize that I value their opinions and I value what they believe the right decision is. And then there'll be other times when I make the decision and I say, okay, yeah, I consider A's feedback, B's feedback, C's feedback, but I still think that the best decision is X. And perhaps them seeing the success of that decision, or that decision having a good outcome, and them supporting it because we've made it as a group, even if they didn't necessarily agree with it, that has power. So then, the next time around, they may trust my opinion more. And they also know that I consider their input as well. So over time, that dynamic builds within the group, and it has a positive outcome for everyone. Everyone starts to feel, okay, I'm valued, and the decisions that we make consider my input. But even if they don't, I back it up anyway.
That transparency of sharing information isn't always available to you. You can't tell everybody everything all the time. So how do you balance that transparency with the need to protect commercial realities?
Well, you have to consider, what can I share versus what can't I? Because there are definitely going to be some decisions, some data that you cannot share. And usually it's not that it can't be shared at all, but it can't be shared at the time. So I would say my approach is I'm trying to be as transparent as possible with as many things as I can be transparent with. And then the few things or that I can't, I have no alternative but to keep to myself. But I know that in the medium to long term, at some point, what has to be revealed will be. So I'm as transparent as I possibly can be. But of course, yeah, there has to be some balance with things that must be kept confidential.
I talk a lot about victim virus and ownership. We discussed earlier on that in your business, it's very easy to blame external factors. It's a very volatile global industry. How do you stop a culture of excuse-making and victim virus from creeping in?
Well, I think the main thing that helps that to not become a habit within the company is me setting an example. So I would like to think that when I have made a boo-boo, as we call it sometimes, I take responsibility for it. So I would say, you know what? I was wrong. My bad. Let's do blah, blah, blah to mitigate whatever it is that went wrong. And I think people seeing that a leader takes that kind of responsibility for the decisions that they've made, even if it hasn't had a positive outcome, is powerful, because they think to themselves, okay, well, if she can do that, then, I should do that too. It's leading by example. So I think that's one way that helps people to not be, always blaming external factors or always blaming one another, because that's also a big one. When I first came out to the company, I do think there was a lot of interdepartmental conflict, and there was a bit of a blame culture, which is easy to develop because, like you said, I mean, this industry is a lot about external factors, and it's a reality. There are a lot of external factors that will affect your ability to provide a good shipping service, right? But at the same time, you do have to balance that, because not everything is the external party's fault. Sometimes, yeah, of course, you make a mistake, you do something wrong, or you're not proactive enough. But I think the example helps, and trying to build that culture internally that we take responsibility. So holding departments or individuals accountable for when they do things not right, that helps too. But I would say the main one is that senior leadership. And I don't just mean me as the CEO, I mean other senior executives. Owning their mistakes is the most powerful way to build that culture of we don't blame outsiders or blame each other.
How do you see other people, other leaders, unintentionally encouraging a victim mindset?
Well, obviously, if they don't set that example, if they always blame external parties or blame other people for things going wrong, that's going to go south fast. And then also, I think if they encourage that sort of interdepartmental blaming, that's not going to help either, because I tend to correct that, nip that in the bud. If we're in a meeting, for example, and something's gone wrong and we're doing like a postmortem, it wouldn't be, well, this department didn't do so that's why it went wrong. I would nip that in the bud and be like, okay, hey, what? It's not about the departments. At the end of the day, in the eyes of the customer, regardless of which individual or which department did something wrong, the customer has had a bad experience. And ultimately, they're not going to say it's this one's fault or that one's fault. It's ISL, it's international shipping. So we need to come up with a solution. We need to improve our processes in the future so that something like that doesn't recur.
Let's talk about doing business in the Caribbean. What's unique, do you think, about leading a business like this in Trinidad and Tobago that maybe somebody in the US or Europe would completely underestimate or misunderstand?
People underestimate people from the Caribbean. They think like, oh, it's a tiny speck on the map, then they're not going to be worldly. They don't really understand, bigger countries, bigger situations, bigger companies. I've had people underestimate me because of that. So I do think that those preconceived notions make people not have the right impression. So I think that's what happens. People underestimate people from the Caribbean, or businesses even from the Caribbean, just because they have their own biases.
Which is ironic, really, because when you think about it, as an island nation, you, by definition, import pretty much everything. So you may even have more experience in shipping than people from elsewhere.
Yes, and I think, too, our environment is even more challenging than a lot of the more developed countries because of nuances with customs, for example. I think our customs and excise is far more difficult to deal with because of the amount of bureaucracy we have to deal with, the amount of, I guess I shouldn't say this, but corruption that we have to deal with as well, which, places like North America won't have. They would have a very well organized system that's all automated and, minimal human interaction. It's going to work well. It's going to happen in one day. We just don't have that. We have to deal with a lot more complicated manual systems. So actually our process is even more complicated and could go even more wrong. So, and we have to deal with and manage that uncertainty.
In terms of management style and leadership, do Caribbean organizations approach power and hierarchy differently?
Well, I think it depends. Some companies would be very different and unique, but I don't know if we can generalize and paint them all with a broad brush, I do think that we're a bit more traditional. So there is a bit more respect perhaps for hierarchy and job title and that kind of thing, just because to some degree, some of the companies would be a bit, I guess the word would be old fashioned. But I definitely don't think that that would be everyone. I definitely think that some businesses would be very forward thinking, have very flat structures, whereas others would be very hierarchical. But of course, if we're talking about government, that would be a totally different ball game altogether.
Does that create any kind of a tension between global standards and local culture?
Yes, because obviously in this business, you're working with lots of different companies, right? Because you can't do the shipping or even the brokerage by yourself. You're subcontracting some of the work. You are depending on carriers to do some of the work. So it's not just you. It's not just your company alone that has influence on the finished product. So definitely there's a lot of nuance because of that.
As a CEO, you're very used to having to communicate with people at all different levels, probably in government and so on and so forth. So communication is quite key. Have you ever said something that was technically correct but landed really badly?
Yes, of course. I think that's just par for the course, Yeah, I've said things that, from a shipping perspective may be accurate. But then when you say it, it could sound like what you said earlier. So you're blaming the environment, or you're blaming external circumstances outside of your own company. And it could come across as though you're not taking full responsibility for something. So yeah, that's definitely happened. And I don't think it's entirely avoidable either. I think that could happen again, unfortunately.
How do you adapt your communication to meet whoever is in the room or whoever holds power in the room?
Well, I think it's really important to be self-aware as a leader, because I like to pride myself on thinking that I can deal with the queen and I can deal with a beggar on the street and speak to them in a language that I think is respectful and they understand what I'm trying to say. So I think I do adjust my communication according to who's in the room. And like you say, not just who has the power, but more, what do I want to achieve in this room today? If it is that I am trying to influence or I'm trying to lead and it's my people, my communication style would be, different. It'll be more informal, like I said, more consultative. Whereas if I'm in a room with a client and I'm trying to have a particular outcome, I'd perhaps be a bit more assertive and professional in my communications. So you definitely do have to adjust according to, I would say, what are you trying to achieve and who's in the room with you.
Coming back to the notion of a family business, how do you go about identifying high potential talent in a family business, recognizing that you're ultimately going to be promoting people who are not in the family?
That's easy. I think talent, or at least for me, I don't know if that's for everyone, but talent is easy to spot. I mean, it's people who have the right ideas, and they don't just have ideas, they actually execute. It's people who are interested in their jobs. It's people who they're knowledgeable, they want to know more. You can suss those people out easily from the beginning, or at least I feel I can. And it doesn't matter to me that they're not family, of course. I mean, in fact, if they're not, perhaps even better. So,
have you ever backed the wrong person?
Yeah. Yes.
What did you learn from that?
I think sometimes spotting talent is great, but the real key is knowing when that talent is ready to move up and take on more responsibility. So sometimes people can be really good in their role, they're excellent, they're doing everything right, they're meeting all their deadlines, meeting all their KPIs, but then you move them up and it's a disaster. I mean, and I think there's the Peter principle, right? So there's where, people do really well in one role, but then you ask them to take on more responsibility and it just all comes crumbling down. So I think it's not just being able to spot the talent, but being able to tell when that talent is actually ready for more.
So we've talked about being CEO of a family business. We've talked about running business in the Caribbean. Do you think power is experienced differently as a female CEO?
Unfortunately, yes. I came back recently from a trip to Taiwan where we were visiting a principal there, and you can tell that people underestimate you when there are certain things there, like being a female is unfortunately one of those that they underestimate. Being from the Caribbean, which is a tiny market on a global scale, is also something that they underestimate your skill. Also, even being young is perceived as a weakness or a disadvantage because it implies a lack of experience. So I think all those things in combination does make someone have an impression of you that's less than what you might actually be. I walked into the room and it was the president of this global carrier, and I could tell just from the tone of the conversation, which was a lot more about the weather and how I was feeling, that he didn't believe that I had any value to add to a serious conversation. And I think in those situations, really you have to assert yourself and make your power be known, whether that is from data, being forthcoming with data, being brave enough to bring up the hard topics instead of just going with the flow or the tone that is set that we're just going to have an informal chitty chat. So I think you have to take control in a situation like that. But it is a reality. It's something actually that when I was much younger, I didn't believe in. I did think that, women were just being fussy or playing the victim card, like, oh, I'm female, nobody takes me seriously. But, having been through it myself, and also not just in a local context, in an international context, experiencing it myself, I realize that sadly, it is a reality.
It's interesting that even now, whenever you read about CEOs, the newspapers, the business journals never preface male CEO, but they always make a point of saying, and female CEO.
Yes. Well, because it's a reality that it's still mostly males, right? And so being female is odd, or you're in a minority. So because of that, they still stress that. It's like when they bring up race too, or it's a business is black owned or female owned. They stress that as well. Why? Because it's a minority thing. It's not normal or it's not common. So therefore, it's something to tout.
So thinking back then to, you said just now about when you were younger, you thought other female leaders were just making this up, they were being overly sensitive, etc.
Yeah.
What advice do you wish you'd had then? And to a certain extent, what advice would you give to women stepping into leadership roles today in traditionally male-dominated industries?
I would say you have to be brave, and you do have to be mindful of that preconceived notion that people have of women, of young women from the Caribbean. I think you have to be mindful of it so that you are aware that, okay, the likelihood is it's not going to happen every time because not everybody has the same mindset, but you have to be mindful and aware when it does happen to not allow it to persist, to nip that in the bud, to be brave enough to speak up and be assertive. I mean, unfortunately, as a man would, so that you are not stuck in that little box or that label of being a girl or being young or being from a small place. You have to step out and make people see that you're not just a young girl from a small place. You have an opinion and you are knowledgeable, you know your industry, and you have value to add.
I have a few rapid fire questions for you. Power or influence?
Influence.
Gut instinct or data?
Data.
Control or adaptability?
Adaptability.
What's one leadership trait that you admire most?
Bravery. I love to see when people are in a room full of 1,000 people and they have the ability to get up and say something that perhaps will not be well accepted by everyone, but they are brave enough to get up and make their point anyway. I admire that deeply because admittedly, I don't know that I always have that bravery myself.
What's one leadership behavior that you have zero tolerance for?
Aggression. I don't like to see and I've seen it, so that's why I know I don't like it. When leaders bang on the table or use foul language or shout. I just think that if you have to do all of that, you're probably just not a good leader. because people shouldn't need that type of nonverbal communication to listen to you.
Okay, couple of philosophical questions just to close out. What's the legacy that you want to leave? Not necessarily or not just as a CEO, but also as a leader of people.
I would say that I would like to be remembered as someone who's fair. Fair to my staff, but also fair to vendors, fair to customers, that whenever I did make a decision, it was fair to whoever was affected by that decision. Not that I was always looking to make money or safeguard myself or defend the decision that I made, but rather that I made the decision that was best for all concerned.
And finally, what's the one thing about Shivana that you wish people understood better?
That I don't have all the answers, that being in a position of leadership is tough, and it doesn't mean that you have all the answers at all. It actually, you're not much different from anyone else. You're still working things out. So, and it's tough.
Shivana Laughlin, CEO of International Shipping Limited. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.
Remember to like and subscribe to the Power in Excellence podcast, and please share it with your friends and colleagues.